spring of 1918, the world was already bleeding from the wounds of war. Millions of men scattered across muddy fields of Europe, breathing in dust, gunpowder, and something far deadlier. At first, no one noticed. A few soldiers coughing in the barracks, a few nurses writing high fever on medical logs. The newspapers didn't mention it. The generals didn't care. There was a war to win. But inside those military camps, especially one in Kansas, USA, something unseen was growing. The morning was cold and gray. At Fort Riley, a U.S. Army training camp, soldiers stood in line for breakfast. The smell of coffee and bacon mixed with the thick, dusty air. Private Albert Gitchell, a healthy young cook, rubbed his eyes. His head pounded. His throat felt like sandpaper. He thought it was just a cold. By noon, over 100 soldiers were down with fever. Within 2 days, over 1,000. Doctors were stunned. It wasn't like anything they had seen before. The men's faces turned blue from lack of oxygen, their lungs filled with fluid. They gasped for air, like drowning men on dry land. The year was 1918. Wartime censorship ruled everything. Newspapers were forbidden from printing bad news that might hurt morale. So they didn't say epidemic. They said unusual influenza. In Spain, however, the press was free, and they reported it honestly. King Alfonso XIII himself got sick, so the world called it the Spanish flu. Ironically, Spain had nothing to do with its origin. The real beginning was right there, in the heart of America. By April, soldiers carrying the virus sailed from U.S. ports to France. They sneezed in crowded ships. They coughed in train cars. They hugged friends goodbye, unknowingly spreading death across oceans. Within weeks, Europe was burning, not just with war, but with fever. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors collapsed beside their patients. Priests ran out of coffins. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. And yet the world still called it just the flu. The first wave of infections, from March to July 1918, was deadly but not catastrophic. People got sick, but most recovered. They thought the danger had passed. America returned to work. Troops kept marching. Factories kept producing weapons. But the virus wasn't done. It was mutating, learning. Somewhere between the trenches of France and the ports of Boston, it became something else. Faster, stronger, deadlier. In early September 1918, Boston's Commonwealth Pier bustled with soldiers and sailors. No one knew that among them, the newly mutated strain had arrived. At the Boston Navy Yard, a sick sailor was brought to the hospital. By nightfall, dozens more followed. Within days, the entire hospital overflowed. Doctors wore makeshift masks of gauze. Nurses soaked cloths in disinfectant and prayed. Bodies piled up in corridors, and outside, the city continued to breathe, unaware of what was coming. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, September 28, 1918. The city planned a massive Liberty Loan parade to support the war effort. Doctors begged the mayor to cancel it. There were already hundreds sick at the Navy Yard, but the mayor refused. He said, "Let the parade go on. It will lift the people's spirits." That Sunday, 200,000 people flooded Broad Street. Children waved flags, bands played, soldiers marched, coughing into the crowd. Within 3 days, every hospital bed in the city was full. By the end of the week, 4,500 people were dead. In cities across America, the same nightmare unfolded. St. Louis shut down schools and theaters. New York ordered people to wear masks. San Francisco made mask wearing mandatory. Those who refused were fined or jailed. Coffins ran out. Church bells tolled all day long. Doctors described patients dying within hours, bleeding from the nose and ears, their lungs turning to foam. The virus didn't discriminate. Young, healthy adults were dying faster than the old. The flu wasn't just killing bodies, it was breaking society. As autumn turned to winter, entire towns vanished. Families locked themselves inside their homes, hanging white sheets on doors when someone died. Mail carriers refused to deliver letters. Priests buried the dead alone. The world had gone quiet, but amid that silence, there was also resilience. Women organized community kitchens, volunteers nursed strangers, doctors, though exhausted, kept working with nothing but courage and soap. Somehow, humanity held on. By early November 1918, the war in Europe ended. The streets filled again with joy, with music, with crowds. People danced, hugged, kissed. But the flu hadn't left. Within days, thousands more fell ill. The celebrations became funerals. Doctors warned, the war may be over, but the battle for survival is not. The second wave lasted through the winter, leaving behind tens of millions of dead worldwide. And then slowly, the fever faded. By the spring of 1919, the Spanish flu had touched every continent, every family, every soul. It killed more people than World War I itself, over 50 million lives. But it also changed medicine forever. Public health systems were reformed, vaccines became a global priority. The concept of social distancing was born, and perhaps most importantly, it taught humanity humility. We realized how fragile our breath really is. More than a century later, we faced another pandemic. Different time, different virus, but the same questions echoed. How do we care for one another?
Winter, 1918. The world had fallen quiet. Church bells that once rang for weddings now tolled for funerals. Main Street stood empty, shutters closed, windows boarded, footsteps vanished. Every home became a fortress, every breath a gamble. It was called the Year Without Touch because even love, that most human of emotions, had turned into something dangerous. Inside small wooden houses across America, people whispered instead of speaking. They left food at doorsteps, prayed through windows. A knock on the door didn't bring comfort anymore. It brought fear. In the small town in Illinois, the Carson family lived at the corner of Elm Street. Henry Carson was a carpenter, a quiet man, strong hands, gentle heart. His wife Martha was known for her kindness. She baked bread for the neighbors every Sunday. But in early October, their youngest daughter, Lucy, began to cough. It started as a tickle in her throat, then came the fever. Within 2 days, Martha was sick too. Henry watched helplessly as the people he loved most gasped for air. The doctor never came. He had collapsed the night before, treating soldiers at the camp outside town. So Henry did what every father did that winter. He waited. He sat by Lucy's bed, holding her hand through a cloth soaked in vinegar, whispering, "Just breathe, sweetheart. Please breathe." When she finally went still, Henry didn't cry. There were no tears left in him. He carried her body to the church, but the priest refused to open the door, so he dug the grave himself, under a maple tree behind their house. He buried her alone, with only the sound of wind through the frozen grass. Not far away, in Philadelphia, a young nurse named Evelyn Brooks refused to go home. She had watched her colleagues die one by one, their masks soaked through with blood and sweat. Still, she kept walking from house to house, carrying nothing but soap, rags, and her faith. People called her the Angel in Gray because her uniform was always covered in dust and ash. One night, she entered a tenement where 6 children were locked inside with their dead mother. She took them all in, fed them, and stayed until help arrived, though she herself was burning with fever. Days later, she was found sitting by a window, head bowed, a smile frozen on her face. Her last diary entry read, "If I must die, let me die helping." Her story, like thousands of others, never made the newspapers, but she became the face of silent heroism, the kind that survives long after the world forgets. Across the United States, schools stood deserted. Blackboards still held half-written lessons, arithmetic problems, unfinished history notes. Children's drawings of flags and soldiers fluttered in the cold breeze that crept through broken windows. In some cities, classrooms were turned into makeshift hospitals. Desks became beds. Teachers became nurses. Children who once played tag now lay still, their small hands clutching handkerchiefs. The laughter of youth had gone silent. Mailmen walked with scarves around their faces, dropping envelopes at doorsteps without knocking. Letters became lifelines, the only proof that someone you loved was still alive. A soldier named James Rowe wrote to his fiancée Clara from an army camp in New Jersey. "Dearest Clara, we are told this illness will pass, but I see more stretchers than smiles now. If I cannot return to you, know that my heart has never left your hands." The letter arrived 3 weeks later. By then, she had already been buried. In New York, lights still flickered in hospitals through the night. Ambulance bells rang like cries in the dark. Doctors begged for help. There were not enough hands to carry the bodies. Volunteers stitched masks by candlelight. Women's clubs cooked soup for strangers they'd never meet. Barber shops were turned into morgues. Theaters became wards. Yet a single word united everyone: hope. Hope that spring would come. Hope that science would find an answer. Hope that someday people could hug again without fear. In Washington, D.C., the government was overwhelmed. Health officials argued about what to tell the public. President Woodrow Wilson himself fell ill during the Paris Peace Conference. Feverish, delirious, barely able to speak. Even in the White House, no one was safe. Some cities enforced strict quarantines, while others denied the problem altogether. Newspapers printed optimism instead of truth. They said everything is under control, while coffins ran out and the smell of death filled the streets. But Americans are stubborn. They buried their dead, washed their hands, and went back to work. Because life, no matter how fragile, always finds a way forward. By December, the snow began to fall. It covered everything: streets, rooftops, and the graves of those who'd gone. Families hung white ribbons on doors to signal their losses. The world looked peaceful again, but beneath that white silence lay millions of unspoken stories. Mothers who never saw their sons return. Lovers who never said goodbye. Doctors who carried guilt heavier than death itself. The newspapers called it the invisible war. But for those who lived through it, it was the year time itself stopped breathing. When the new year arrived, 1919, the virus slowly began to fade. Not because of medicine, not because of miracles, but because the sick had either died or survived. And those who lived carried invisible scars. They had learned how fragile normal life was, how precious touch could be, how silence could feel like both safety and sorrow. People began to smile again, but carefully. They shook hands, but hesitated. They loved, but remembered. The Spanish flu took more American lives than any war before it, but it also gave birth to something stronger than fear: compassion. Hospitals were rebuilt. Public health laws were created. Scientists began to study viruses in ways never done before. And those who had seen death up close learned a quiet truth: that survival is not the absence of loss. It is the courage to keep living in spite of it. A nurse's courage, a father's prayer, a child's smile.
The fever had finally passed, but the silence it left behind was louder than ever. Across America, the morning sun rose on empty streets and tired souls. The Spanish flu had taken its toll, more than 600,000 American lives. Every town, every home, every heart carried a scar. Yet the world did what it always does after tragedy. It began to rebuild. Factories opened their doors again, men returned to their jobs, women returned to the markets, and children, with shy smiles, returned to their classrooms. But nothing felt the same. People spoke softly, moved carefully, looked at each other with quiet gratitude. The handshake, once a symbol of trust, now carried hesitation. Neighbors waved from afar, uncertain if closeness was ever safe again. And still, life pushed forward, gently, stubbornly, beautifully. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, the rhythm of modern life began to hum once more. Streetcars clanged through the avenues, jazz poured from bar windows. A new sound filled the air, not coughing, not crying, but music. Musicians played as if to drown out the ghosts of yesterday. The roaring 20s were being born, not from joy, but from survival. After so much death, people were desperate to live. They danced harder, laughed louder, loved faster. Every drink, every song, every embrace was a rebellion against the silence that had once ruled the world. Scientists, too, were changed forever. Doctors who had watched helplessly during the pandemic vowed never again to be unprepared. In 1919, new research laboratories began to emerge. For the first time, scientists started to truly understand viruses, those invisible killers that could cross oceans faster than ships. Dr. William Welch of Johns Hopkins declared, "We have faced an enemy we could not see. We must now learn to see what was once unseen." It was the birth of modern virology. Vaccines, sanitation systems, and public health departments across America began to grow. The Centers for Disease Control, the idea of it, was born from these ashes years before it even had a name. The government, shaken by its own failures, began to listen to science. Local health boards were given power. Medical schools expanded. Newspapers started printing advice columns on hygiene, disease prevention, and healthy living. People learned to wear masks when sick. They learned the value of soap, sunlight, and fresh air. And most importantly, they learned that truth saves lives more than optimism does, because lies had killed more people than the flu ever could. In small towns, recovery came slower. Families still left empty chairs at dinner tables. Children grew up without parents. A generation was missing, but the living carried their memory like fire. Communities began to build memorials, not of stone, but of service. They planted trees, started libraries, opened hospitals, each one dedicated to someone lost. They didn't want monuments of grief. They wanted monuments of gratitude. Meanwhile, America's heart was changing. Before the pandemic, the country was defined by war, the Great War. After it, the focus shifted inward, to healing, to living, to progress. The economy began to boom. Cars replaced horses. Telephones connected distant towns. And women, who had held the country together through war and plague, demanded a voice. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women won the right to vote. Historians say it was inevitable, but those who lived through the flu knew it was earned, in blood, in sweat, in endless nights of care. They had proven that courage had no gender. But not everyone could escape the shadows. Doctors spoke of nervous exhaustion. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress. Survivors often woke in the middle of the night, hearing phantom coughs or smelling disinfectant in the air. Some couldn't bear to be in crowded rooms again. Some refused to visit graves, believing their loved ones still watched from the window. The world was breathing again, but not everyone could keep up with its rhythm. As the 1920s rolled on, time did what time always does. It buried the pain beneath layers of progress. People stopped mentioning the flu.
It became an unspoken chapter, too heavy, too haunting. But in photographs, the truth remained. Rows of hospital beds in gymnasiums, doctors in white coats, faces hidden behind cloth masks, children staring out of windows, waiting for parents who never came home. Those images never left the American heart. And yet, even in silence, history remembers. The Spanish flu reshaped the nation's soul, teaching it that science must stand before pride, that kindness is the truest medicine, and that survival means learning how to begin again. In the years that followed, America stepped boldly into the future. Skyscrapers rose, radios sang, the jazz age bloomed like a garden after rain. But beneath the laughter and lights, there was a quiet promise that if darkness ever returned, the world would remember how to fight it. A nurse's courage in Philadelphia, a father's tears in Illinois, a scientist's vow in a cold laboratory, all of it became part of a collective memory, a reminder that hope, once awakened, never truly dies. By 1922, the pandemic was a story whispered more than told, but for those who had lived through it, every sunrise felt sacred. Every shared meal, every child's laughter, every unmasked smile was a victory. They had seen the end of the world.
Time moves forward, but echoes never fade. The year 1918 slowly vanished into history books, yet its whisper lingered in the corners of time, a warning that the world would one day forget and then remember. In the decades that followed, life roared ahead. The Jazz Age turned into the Great Depression, the Great Depression into World War II, and through it all, the memory of the Spanish flu became a ghost, silent, almost erased. But history has a strange rhythm. When people forget, it repeats its song. In the 1950s, scientists studying the remnants of the old flu virus discovered something terrifying. It had never truly gone away. Hidden in the DNA of birds and animals, it had simply changed its form, waiting for another chance. And as the world grew more connected, that chance came again and again. The Asian flu of 1957, the Hong Kong flu of 1968, the swine flu of 1976, each wave smaller, but each a reminder that humanity still walked a fragile line between progress and peril. Airplanes had replaced ships, cities had replaced villages, and the world had become one giant breathing organism. What infected one could soon infect all. By the late 20th century, new words entered the human vocabulary: pandemic, quarantine, vaccine. But to most people, they were just words, belonging to history, not real life. Until the 21st century arrived, and the echoes returned, louder than ever. In 2003, the SARS outbreak rattled Asia. In 2009, H1N1 reminded scientists of 1918, eerily similar, genetically almost the same. And then came 2020, a year that would turn the entire planet into a mirror of the past. They called it COVID-19, but those who had read history called it something else: the second coming of the invisible war. Lockdowns, masks, empty streets, the same fear, the same silence, the same desperate hope for a cure. A century apart, yet hauntingly identical. In 1918, people closed churches. In 2020, they closed airports. In 1918, masks were made of cloth and fear. In 2020, masks were made of science and survival. Different times, same heartbeat. Doctors once again became soldiers, nurses once again became heroes, and scientists, now armed with technology their predecessors could never dream of, raced against time. In just months, vaccines were created, a miracle born from lessons of a century past, because every study, every research paper, every virologist who fought in 2020 stood on the shoulders of those who fell in 1918. But the echoes weren't just in science. They were in emotion. People rediscovered loneliness. They learned the weight of distance, the ache of isolation, the value of a single touch. Families watched loved ones through screens, not windows. Funerals happened on video calls. Birthdays were celebrated with masks instead of candles. It was, once again, a year without touch. Yet, amid the grief, there was light. Neighbors delivered groceries to strangers. Doctors slept on hospital floors. Musicians sang from balconies. Technology became the new form of togetherness. Humanity found new ways to stay human. When vaccines arrived, people lined up under open skies, crying, laughing, clapping, not just because they were safe, but because they had survived something ancient, something familiar. It was as if the ghosts of 1918 stood among them, whispering, "You learned. Finally, you learned." But even after the pandemic began to fade, the world didn't return to what it was. It never does. People talked differently. They washed hands more often. They wore masks, even for common colds. They valued science, communication, and truth in ways they never had before. The mistakes of 1918, denial, misinformation, pride, were once again seen for what they were, deadly. But this time, the world had a chance to correct them. Governments began funding health infrastructure, research into vaccines for future viruses skyrocketed, and a global understanding emerged that we are not divided by borders when it comes to disease, but united by breath. What one breathes, all breathe. The air connects us, always has, always will. Still, not all lessons were easy to learn. Some people refused vaccines, just as others had refused masks 100 years before. Conspiracy spread faster than the virus itself. Social media became the new battlefield, truth versus fear, knowledge versus chaos. And once again, humanity stood at a crossroads. Would we learn from our past or repeat it? Perhaps the most haunting truth is that both answers are true. We learn, we forget, and then we learn again. That is what it means to be human. Fragile, forgetful, but endlessly resilient. Because even when the world seems to end, we always find a way to begin again. The echoes of 1918 still live in hospitals, in research labs, in the stories of those who wear white coats and masks. They live in every nurse who stays a little longer, every doctor who refuses to give up, every teacher who teaches through a screen, and every parent who whispers bedtime stories through a door. Those echoes are not curses, they are reminders that compassion is timeless and courage repeats itself across generations. A century apart, two pandemics told the same story, a story of fear and faith, loss and love, isolation and connection. But beneath all that, one message rang clear. Humanity's strength is not in avoiding death, it's in choosing life again and again. And maybe, just maybe, the souls of 1918 smiled when they saw the world of 2020 fighting back not with superstition or silence, but with science, compassion, and hope. So when the next pandemic comes, and history tells us it will, the world will remember, because history's echoes may fade.
The story of the Spanish flu was never just about disease. It was about people, about how fragile we are, and yet how unbreakable we can be. The virus that once silenced the world also revealed what truly keeps humanity alive: compassion, courage, and connection. 100 years later, we faced another invisible enemy. But this time, we didn't fight it alone. We fought it together. Across continents, across screens, across fear itself. Every generation learns something new from the one before it. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. There will always be new challenges, new pandemics, new storms to weather. But there will also always be people. People who refuse to give up, who choose hope when fear is easier. That's the story that connects 1918 and 2020. That's the story that connects you and me. So what are the lessons for tomorrow? To listen to science, to trust truth, to care for each other, even when the world tells you to be afraid. To remember that history is not something written in books. It's something we live every single day. If the people of 1918 could speak to us now, they wouldn't tell us to fear the future. They'd tell us to protect it, to build it, to live it with kindness. Because every act of love, every moment of courage, every whisper of empathy is a vaccine against despair. The future doesn't belong to those who survive. It belongs to those who learn. And now, if you're still here, listening to these final words, thank you. Truly. You've just spent time traveling through one of the darkest and most powerful stories in human history. That means you care about understanding where we came from, so we can walk wisely into where we're going. Your time, your attention, they matter. So from the heart, thank you for being here. If this story touched you, inspired you, or even made you think, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more untold stories from history, from humanity, from the heart. Because this isn't just a channel, it's a community.